Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to Reset Live Lectures. Dear friends, as you know that we started a series on philosophy of mind and today we are conducting yet another lecture in the same series. In today's lecture, we will take up the concept of Problem of Qualia. To discuss this topic, we have with us a subject expert Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thanks, Amrit. Hello, viewers. So, as you are already aware, that we have been talking about philosophy of mind, different issues involved in philosophy of mind in this series, and in that line, we saw that how when we look at the point of view in Western philosophy, it is dominantly in favor of physicalism. And we saw how starting from substance dualism, how there have been different takes on the issue of physicalism, whereas in dualism we want to maintain that mind is a non-physical substance, and as opposed to that, body is a physical kind of a substance. So these are two different kind of substances, and since there is some kind of coordination between the two, we want to, with Descartes, Descartes suggested that we sort of suppose that there is some kind of coordination. It becomes possible in these two different spheres through what he believes was a part of our brain, namely a part of our brain called pineal gland. As a matter of fact, around that time, because since he's writing in post-enlightenment period, and but at the same time, what we must remember is that obviously immediately after enlightenment, it was not that all the religious influences which were sought to be put aside when it came to different subjects of study. Though sort of there was a strong plea against that, but most thinkers were sort of couldn't completely wean themselves off from such religious influences. And Descartes was not an exception in that line. So he thought that he shows both kind of he seems to be somewhere in the in some kind of a middle region where he hasn't completely given away some of the religious influences that that came to him as a legacy of pre-enlightenment period, when religion was supposed to be the source of any knowledge pertaining to whatever subject of study. So, but at the same time, he seems to be also influenced by some of the scientific developments that were so rather than there's some kind of changes that were happening even in the domain of knowledge production generally. Now, sort of scientific method had become a dominant tool of study, dominant method that wasn't followed as a part of study of any subject matter. So on the one hand, he had that kind of a mechanistic view, which was one of the dominant characteristic of scientific method, but at the same time he hadn't completely kept himself. He hadn't completely gone away from any influence of pre-enlightenment period either. So what we find in him is that he had a very mechanistic on one hand he sort of wanted to work with that kind of a mechanistic view, and he believed that there were some kind of spirits that were sort of doing rounds in our body in a certain way, and it was believed by many thinkers of the day that that many of the physical objects, actually when our eyes come into contact with them, So it was believed that many of these physical objects send out corpuscles, some kind of some kind of some kind of unknown matter was sent towards our sensory system, and which would trigger off a kind of which would trigger off some kind of mechanistic some chain of cause and effect. And it was believed that it would animate, so to speak, some of these spirits inside us, and ultimately, because of that, some kind of perception would take place in the mind, and so some kind of a cognitive episode, some kind of judgment finally would arise in our mind about some object that kind of seems to impact us in a certain way. So, Descartes also seems to follow that line of thinking, and believed that some spirits inside us get animated, and ultimately, since there has to be some kind of impetus produced in mind, in brain, which would give rise to, which would kind of impact the other sphere of existence, namely soul or mind. So he thought that pineal gland somewhere in our brain was that region where some of these spirits, when they get animated, they impact it. And in that way, some kind of, because of that impact, so because of that causal chain, some kind of cognitive episode arises in our mind, because of which we have certain kind of phenomenal experiences, and even though we could doubt those phenomenal experiences, but we couldn't in a certain way doubt the very sort of arena where these cognitive episodes were happening. Because even when I doubt, which is a kind of judgment, which is tantamount to a judgment, so it requires some kind of an arena to arise at all, and it arises in consciousness. So even when you're doubting, you cannot doubt that you doubt, and in that sense, it's sort of this is something. Some kind of a ground from where this judgment arises, something that cannot be doubted, because it's supported by so to speak, pure consciousness. So therefore, he believed that that doubting or thinking, which is an act in a certain way, which arises, because in a certain kind of awareness. So the thinking is something that we cannot doubt. Now, whether we want to believe that thinking is a kind of phenomenal experience, dominantly we would say yes. And the problem, ever since, has been that dualism has its own set of problems, as we have already seen, whether in the garb of interactionism, parallelism, or occasionalism. But from there, if we follow the trajectory, the history of a philosophy of mind, we find that we have been mainly inclined towards physicalism, but as we saw, whatever whatever ideas whatever views we may have regarding how mind could be related to something physical, or mind being a function of the physical neurophysical neurobiological setup that we have inside us. But each one of those takes has some deficiencies or the other. We have been talking about that in our past lectures, of course, since we want to broadly look at the history of philosophy of mind here. So we have just about we are doing it in a very introductory way. So we are just about scratching the surface. Of course, each of these each of these, sort of subdomains within philosophy of mind has lots of details about it, but we have been looking at it from the point of view of introduction to philosophy of mind. So the idea here is that now the dominant problem that has been there in most of these physicalist theories was that of qualia. So qualia is one of the main issues that seems very, very difficult to resolve, and which keeps philosophy of mind keep moving in ever sort of new directions of research. But before we start talking further about it, maybe we may want to look at what exactly we mean by qualia, though we have been briefly discussing it in our previous lectures. But probably we may want to remind ourselves about what exactly is the meaning of qualia. So now the meaning of qualia, to put it very broadly, so I'm sort of referring to again Neil Campbell's book, A Brief History of Philosophy of Mind. So qualia, often also referred to as phenomenal properties, are the subjective aspects of experience, that is, the way sensations feel to those who have them. So this is a very broad definition. So basically, the idea is that on one hand there are objects, and and then they sort of when we perceive them, then there is some kind of cognitive episode that happens, and then it ultimately results in some kind of judgment. Now, what we are interested in is to understand this entire process, how a particular object is grasped by us through our sensory apparatus, and what exactly goes on finally, sort of when some kind of a cognitive episode ultimately results from it. So we want to have some kind of consistent explanation which would explain this kind of a passage from sensory input to some kind of phenomenal experience in our mind of the object concerned. So the idea is here is that we may explain, because because the rapid advancement that science has been making ever since after Enlightenment, we sort of still the main issue here is that through some kind of scientific explanation, we might explain what exactly goes on when an object is given to us in it becomes available to us for cognition, and how sort of what kind of neural activities take place when some kind of perception takes place, and so on and so forth. But the problem here is ultimately that this entire episode of phenomenal sort of experience of something that always remains to be explained. I mean, it always goes in excess of any kind of physicalist explanation of perception and so on and so forth. Say, for example, if we may know what what do we mean by red color. So when we see something red, we can say, well, these are the kind of rays that get reflected from the surface of the object, and since all other colors are kind of absorbed by that object, and only certain kind of waves with certain frequency and wavelength, only they become available to us for our sensory input. This is why red color is seen, and as a matter of fact, since the waves can be recorded, we can actually have some kind of a graph representing those waves, and somebody could tell us, well, see, this is what seeing, this is what red means. But we may understand what is what does it mean for a thing to be red. But we haven't yet understood what exactly it means to see red. What it means to be red is a different thing. What it it means to see red is a different kind of question, which pertains to what we have been hitherto calling qualia, because it pertains to, as just stated, subjective aspects of experience, the way sensations feel to those who have them. So even some kind of physicalist explanation may very well tell us what exactly is happening, but what exactly is the nature, physical nature of what has been seen, but the actual seeing of that thing, that doesn't get explained in the same act. It sort of seems to seems to sit apart from that explanation, and and still requiring an answer. So that is one of the issues that any physicalist count has been struggling with. So the main idea here is that what it feels to see red is different from what it means to see red. So probably there could be a physicalist explanation what it means to see red through different kind of wavelengths and whatever, but that doesn't explain what it feels to see red, or what it means to see red. So so that is one of the main questions. To take another example into consideration here would be that even when I sort of I speak something, when I'm saying something right now, a scientist could very well say, well, see, now this is the recorded lecture, and whatever I'm saying could be projected as say, for example, whatever I'm speaking, there could be an audio recording of it, and somebody could just sort of show the modulation of the waves on the screen, that see, this is what the lecture is happening, this is what the lecture is. But the physical sound itself doesn't contain everything that I'm saying. What I'm saying is in excess of those physical sounds, in the sense that it requires a very different kind of mechanism to understand. I mean, if sort of which is a much higher order kind of thing, and similar kind of difficulties are being faced in the realm of language acquisition also. Because what we call language is it sort of has this physical part in terms of the sound waves and so on and so forth, but the meaning is not something that is intrinsic to them, because had it been so, then we would have understood whatever is being said only in virtue of those those sound waves, so to speak. And since it requires some kind of a mental cognition, so that means language is inside our mind. It's not out there in its physical sort of form. So this is one of the main issues here at stake, that whether sort of we talk about linguistic cognition, whether we talk about some kind of perceptual cognition. So the physical part of it explains a lot about what is happening, but it doesn't explain the phenomenal experience that we sort of go through. And that has been a trouble all through for most the physicalist kind of explanation. So here we want to look at sort of what kind of what is the exact nature of problem that arises when we start talking about qualia or phenomenal properties or sort of individual experiences, phenomenal experiences, and how this problem has been formulated by different thinkers. So this is what we want to look at today. So now to sort of basically understand the problem, and let me read again a small passage from Neil Campbell. He says, and I quote, "We have already seen that these properties can be a thorn in the side of physicalist theories." These properties meaning phenomenal properties that we call qualia. So these qualities, the qualia, can be a thorn in the side of physicalist theories. Behaviorism seemed inadequate in part because it ignored the subjective character of sensations by reducing them to mere behavioral dispositions. The type identity theory got into trouble because it seemed to imply that physically diverse creatures could not have the same kind of qualia. Functionalism looked unappealing because it placed qualia on the sideline by claiming that the subjective characters of our sensations play no role in their identity. So all through, qualia has been one of the central, issues, one of the main trouble for any kind of physicalist explanation. So should we take it to mean then? Now the big question is then: should we mean it? Should we take it to mean that qualia undermines all kinds of physicalism? So that becomes a major issue. Now there are like, apart from some other thinkers, Thomas Nagel and Frank Jackson are considered two main thinkers who formulate the problem of qualia in a more sort of robust, understandable way, and try to show that it's not easy, and it's probably looks like almost impossible to resolve this problem of qualia. Though Thomas Nagel doesn't say it's impossible, but he wants to show that this problem is very difficult to resolve unless we have some kind of a paradigm shift, some major paradigm shift in science, in the way we have been going about science, the way we have been going about looking at physicalist explanations of phenomenal experiences. Unless there is some kind of a paradigm shift there, in the present circumstances, where there has been no big breakthrough in this direction, where there has been no paradigm shift, given the current parameters, it seems almost impossible to resolve this issue. So Thomas Nagel wrote one very famous paper, which was published in Philosophical Review, most probably in 1974. So that the paper was titled "What is it to be like a bat?" The issue is that one of the problems in qualia is that in philosophy of mind, one of our broad concerns seems to be how to explain consciousness in some kind of physicalist terms, because consciousness seems to be of a very different nature. And now the problem there is that whenever we talk about consciousness, then when we raise any problem about consciousness, then a question that lurks at the background of in this question, what is consciousness, is what is it to be conscious? So whenever we talk about the nature of consciousness, what exactly is what exactly is the nature of consciousness? Whether we know it or not, the question that we are tackling with is, what is it to be conscious? What does it mean to be conscious? And when we say what does it mean to be conscious, then from somewhere there seems to be some kind of somebody who is experiencing it. So some kind of a person, so to speak, though we don't want to enter into a discussion of theory of person here, which is like a broad area in itself, separate area in itself. So, but the idea overall here is that whenever we talk about consciousness, we are at the same time, when we raise any question about consciousness, we are also dealing with the question, what is it to be conscious? And that would mean what is it for somebody to be conscious? So now we can see how from like the study of nature of consciousness, the question arises what it means to be conscious, and what does it mean for somebody to be conscious. So that somebody that person who's conscious, inevitably comes into the picture. We just can't avoid it, because when we're talking about consciousness, that means we're talking about somebody who's conscious, because consciousness doesn't exist apart from somebody who's conscious, and because if there is any access to consciousness, then it is through or via the person who has it. So any phenomenal experience happens, so to speak, to somebody, and that becomes an issue, because then we want to sort of then invariably the something that we will have to work with is that consciousness is a first person phenomena. Is sort of something that is available to somebody who has it. And that makes the issue problematic for us. And this is precisely what Thomas Nagel, through his paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, wants to sort of explicate before us. So to sort of first of all, to sum up what he's doing, let me sort of again sort of read. So he sums up what is it to be conscious in the following way: if something is conscious, then there is something it is like to be that thing. To be conscious is to have subjectivity, that is, to experience the world in a particular way. The items that make up consciousness are the qualia, associated with individual experiences or sensations, each of which has its own felt subjective character. So this is, this is in a certain way what this is in a certain way the main thing that purport of the argument offered by Thomas Nagel. We will look at what thought experiment he wants us to conduct. So the problem basically that he is that he wants to sort of bring forth through this through his argument is that consciousness involves being consciousness and being conscious, and being involves somebody being conscious. Subjectivity therefore is inevitable and ineluctable for consciousness to be what it is. So now, the problem that Thomas Nagel sort of puts before us is that he asks the question, what is it for a bat to be conscious? What we're when we are asking this question, what exactly is it that we are asking? So, if we suppose that bats are conscious, then we are saying that there is something it is like to be a bat. So he formulates, the question in a slightly different way. So what he says, whenever we say, whenever we are asking any question about consciousness, then we are basically saying what it means for something to be conscious. Then there is something it is like to be that thing. That inevitably, sort of comes into the picture. There unavoidably, inevitably comes into the picture. So then we are saying that there is something it is like to be a bat. So if we ask some question like is bat conscious, then the question that we are asking is what is it for a bat to be conscious. We are not asking a question about consciousness generally. It seems to be a kind of sort of broader objective kind of question. When we say what is it for a bat to be conscious, it seems to us that there could be some direct way of reaching that consciousness and examining it. But the point that Thomas Nagel wants to make is that the question ultimately is what is it for the bat. It's not that so the question cannot be tackled directly by looking into the consciousness of bat, because that's not available. The consciousness of bat is available only to the bat in question. So therefore, the question is when we are saying what is it for a bat to be conscious, is is basically about the perspective of the bat in question, because we are talking about the consciousness of. So the question is what is it for something to be a bat. So the question is put from the side of the bat in question. So And sort of, even though this question, when he's sort of as posed in the title of his paper, what is it like to be a bat, that itself suggests that basically, what he's saying is that when we are talking about consciousness of somebody, we will have to take that somebody into account, without which, because we don't have any direct access towards the consciousness of that thing. So friends, we will talk about this this paper in more detail when we return after a short break. Thank you. Welcome back, viewers. So we were talking about what it means. We were talking about the paper by Thomas Nagel. What is it to be like a bat? So now in this sort of, when we ask this question, as we were trying to find what Thomas Nagel seems to be suggesting is that when we are talking about the consciousness of bat, that means we are asking the question. The question could be reformulated in this way: that what does it mean for the bat to be conscious? So it's not a general question about sort of as if we have a direct access to it. Now, for those of us, who think that this question is is this too far removed from reality? This question, sort of is and such questions could be important for us because of several reasons. Say, for example, even in vegetarianism, debate about vegetarianism. There is, sort of non-vegetarians can always say, well, if we are against non-vegetarianism because it involves killing, then we cannot be sure, because trees also have certain kind of life. So when we are sort of taking something away from trees, then that also means, in a certain way, taking life away. So the debate there is, again, ultimately, sort of not always, but one of the questions is always, in general sort of parlance, one of the questions is is are vegetables or leaves some kind of some things that have life. Do they have some kind of, and when we ask that question, we are also asking the question, do they have any conscious experiences? But can we really have any sort of final conclusive evidence for that? Because that question is again of the same kind of question as raised by Thomas Nagel. Like, what is it for? So when we are asking, are vegetables, are trees conscious, we are asking the same kind of question. What is it for a tree to be conscious? So that's a question which is almost sort of very difficult to resolve, if not impossible. Say, another example would be that now sort of people who argue against capital punishment, apart from the fact that the life is taken away, another fact is that it's too harsh. So even in the countries where capital punishment still continues, say for example in USA, so there scientists are trying to find easier and easier ways to bring the life of a person to an end. So instead of hanging them, something that's still practiced in many countries, so what they do, they want to find out easier ways. So one way is to give lethal injection, as we know that in several countries this is how the capital punishment is given to a person concerned. But again, there one of the main areas of debate there has been maybe even that injection could be something that's too painful, sort of, because now the person is not there to tell you what kind of experiences that person may be going through. So that phenomenal experience cannot be available to somebody from outside of the person who's experiencing it. But if you experience it, then you're not there. So then, sort of again, like here we require some kind of an objective account of what goes on, which seems impossible to sort of to come forth as a as a kind of a conclusive evidence. So this debate, sort of like this example, which seems to be a little far removed, we can understand that these questions, if we have answer to them, then many other debates would be affected by like if there is a conclusive answer to this question, what is it for a bat to be conscious. So basically, as we just learned, the question is, what is it for a bat to be conscious? Now, in order to resolve this question, what it means to be like a bat, there are two things we can do in order to find the answer to this question. One is that we can imagine ourselves as bats. But we could sort of just reflect over what would it mean for sort of me to be a bat, because I have access to only my own consciousness. So we could imagine ourselves as as hanging upside down by trees and so on and so forth. But the problem here would be that what it means for you to be a bat when you are exercising your imagination in that direction. All that you are doing when you imagine yourself as a bat is you're trying to know what it means for you to be a bat, but not what it is to be a bat as such, or for a bat to be a bat. So the question is, what is it for a bat to be a bat, meaning to say, like, what is it for that bat to be conscious? So when we exercise our own imagination, it's about us. So that doesn't take us anywhere in the direction of finding an answer, finding a solution to this problem. Now, another way out is physical. We can go about it in a physicalist way, and we may want to study the physiology of bat. Now, the problem, as Thomas Nagel points out, is in this case would be that to understand what it is like to be a bat requires us to adopt a bat's point of view. But studying how a bat's perceptual system functions is not adopting a bat's point of view. It is to take a human point of view of a bat's physiology. So the question here is that we want to study bat's perceptual system. Now, that perceptual system is only available from the perspective of the bat. In order to have a view of that perceptual system, we'll have to put ourselves at the vantage point of bat, not only in physical terms. I mean, we'll have to somehow place ourselves inside the mind, which is almost which is obviously an impossible thing to do. So all we sort of know when we perform this physiological kind of examination, we are just taking a human point of view of bat's physiology. We are not even coming anywhere close to having an actual perspective towards the consciousness of a bat, which means what is it for a bat to be conscious. So therefore, whether in order to know what is it like to be a bat, whether we simply instead of going into any physicalist direction, we may want to just imagine ourselves, we want to exercise our imagination and want to see how we could think of being a bat. But that doesn't solve the problem, because it only tells you what it would probably be for you to be a bat. It doesn't tell you what it is to be a bat as such. in Kantian terms, to be a thing in itself, or what is it for a bat to be bat. And on the other hand, if we take the physicalist route, again, what we are doing is where we are taking a human point of view of bat's physiology. Nowhere in the process of this physical examination, nowhere in the process would we be able to place ourselves at the vantage point, at the at some point where we get an actual perspective towards the perceptual system of the bat. That point is it never becomes available to us. So if certain facts about consciousness are accessible only from from point of view, and this is what we can conclude from our discussion. So if certain facts about consciousness are accessible only from a particular point of view, that is the first person point of view of the conscious subject, then it is hard to see how the true nature of consciousness could be revealed by an analysis of a conscious being's neurophysiology. This is how Neil Campbell puts it. When physicalists tell us that consciousness is a brain state, a functional state, or some other kind of physical state, they purport to be telling us what consciousness really is. They are identifying the objective nature of consciousness, or at least they claim to be so. They claim to be doing so. A physical analysis of consciousness, though, requires us to abandon the point of view of the conscious subject. So this is the actual requirement. When we do some kind of a physiological examination or some kind of physical analysis of consciousness, then we require to abandon the point of view of the conscious subject, our own point of view in a certain way, the first person point of view, in favor of a third person scientific perspective. Instead of having a first person view, when we are theorizing about something, that means we are making something available to anybody's perspective. So something that is universally true, not only true from a first person perspective, but generally true. Only then will become a theory or a law. So we'll have to move from first person perspective to an objective scientific perspective, which in case of phenomenal experiences, in case of phenomenal properties, seems something impossible. And this is where the problem of qualia comes. Now, to return to Nagel's example, if bat consciousness is defined in relation to the bat's point of view, then studying a bat's neurophysiology is by definition to abandon the bat's point of view. The moment we do a physiological study of the bat's perceptual system, then we are abandoning, in that very act of examination, we are abandoning the bat's point of view. If this is true, then it seems that studying a bat's brain and perceptual system cannot be the study of a bat's consciousness, which we thought we would do when we do this such kind of physiological examination. So whatever else we may be doing, but we are not doing in that case the study of bat's consciousness, because that perspective becomes we sort of lost to us the moment we sort of involve ourselves in physiological examination. By analogy, the study of human brain and perceptual system cannot reveal the true nature of consciousness either. To study the physical processes involved in thought and perception is to abandon the first person point of view that defines consciousness. So say for example, there could be some other, kind of sort of attempts at trying to understand something, regarding which we could come to some kind of consensus. So the problem is that, it's not about two points of view coming into some kind of debate with each other, some kind of contention with each other. That, could have been resolvable in some way. If there are two persons arguing about one particular object, and then there is a difference of opinion, then there is always a possibility of arriving at some kind of a consensus, because both of these two different people have two different approaches, and through some kind of negotiation, they could come and arrive at some consensus regarding the thing in question. But here, when we are asking the questions like, what is it for a bat to be bat? that kind of thing wouldn't do, because it's not that we are negotiating with the bat who has that first order experience. Here the point is that we'll have to somehow inform ourselves of the bat's perspective. So it's a different kind of a thing. To understand it more fully, we'll have to sort of, we'll have to contrast it with some other kind of, similar kind of experiment. So Nagel, sort of, to make it more explicit, the point in question, to make his question more explicit, Nagel contrasts the attempt to provide an objective scientific characterization of a phenomenon like lightning with the attempt to provide an objective scientific characterization of consciousness. Lightning has an objective nature. This is again, from Neil Campbell, that is not necessarily revealed in our perceptual experiences of it. We see lightning as a bright flash of light in the sky. However, other creatures might perceive it quite differently. For example, Martians might be able to detect lightning as an ultraviolet flash, which is beyond our visual range. As a matter of fact, we don't need to sort of go as far back as Martians. As a matter of fact, now we know that many flowers, sort of send out some kind of ultraviolet rays as well. And most these birds, when they feel attracted to, towards that flower, what they see is they see those ultraviolet rays coming up from the flower. So that's for their seeing the flower is very much different from our seeing of the flower. So now, but in this case, although humans and Martians detect lightning differently, this is no obstacle to our agreeing on an objective characterization of lightning. So as I just stated, if there are two people arguing about the same thing, then sort of differences could always be negotiated. So here in this example, we can both agree that lightning is a rapid electrical discharge without agreeing about how lightning appears to us perceptually. What our agreement about the nature of lightning consists in is a conceptual movement from our own subjective point of view on lightning, that is for humans, a bright blue-white flash of light in the sky, for Martians an ultraviolet flash. So from here towards an understanding that is not associated with any particular point of view. So in that case, where we are arguing about two perspectives on a third different thing, such differences could always be negotiated. But when the question like what is it like to be a bat, that's a very different kind of question which doesn't lend itself to same kind of negotiation, because it's not that we are sort of negotiating with the bat's perspective. There's no such kind of negotiation happening. Here the onus is upon us, if to have in order to know what it means to be a bat. For a bat to be conscious, we need to have the perspective of the bat. We need to have a first hand perspective of the consciousness of bat. So there is it's not like coming to terms with the consciousness of the bat. It means just identifying ourselves with that perspective, which is which is an impossible thing to do. But nevertheless, something which has to be done if we have to find an actual conclusive answer to the question that Thomas Nagel is raising. So now, sort of further, they to read a passage from Neil Campbell again. The attempt to provide an objective characterization of consciousness faces a challenge that does not exist in the case of lightning. The nature of lightning is not something that has to be understood from a particular first-person perspective. In fact, the point is not to understand it from any particular perspective. So, otherwise, sort of this is what what we want to do, which is why it is so easy for us and our Martian friends to agree about what lightning really is, because there we want to have an understanding of it which is devoid of which is not dependent upon any particular point of view. And if there are two perspectives available, then we may want to sort of broaden our horizons, so to speak, if we want to use Gadamer's terminology. and which would, in turn broaden the horizons of both of us. So the nature of consciousness, however, as opposed to that, is something that has to be understood from a particular perspective. Here, we are not trying to, we cannot have an understanding which is devoid of any perspective, because consciousness is something which belongs to a particular perspective, and therefore any study of consciousness would demand having that particular perspective. But the moment we take a particular perspective, that means we can never have an understanding which is devoid of any perspective, the kind of understanding science demands, scientific methodology demands, and physicalist explanation, being sort of some kind of scientific explanation, would also have the same demands, and therefore such approaches would never be able to arrive at any conclusion. So, the nature of consciousness, however, is something that has to be understood only from a particular perspective. For it is the taking of a first-person perspective on the world, since consciousness is what it is like to be that conscious creature. So, when we're talking about consciousness, what we mean, as we learned right in the beginning, the question there, some kind of a question which is sort of encapsulated inside this broader question is, what is it like to be that conscious creature? When we ask questions about consciousness generally, then an encapsulated broad sort of deeper question is, what is it for a creature, for that thing to be conscious? So there is no sort of there's no general universal account, because consciousness is by definition something that becomes available via a particular perspective. So, a physicalist understanding of any phenomenon, including consciousness, requires giving up the point of view of the conscious subject. But if we abandon this, have we not thereby ceased to talk about consciousness? This is again sort of trying to frame the same question another way. Haven't we just changed the subject? Nagel's view, these observations lead to a dilemma. If physicalism is true, there must be an objective physical description of subjectivity. This is, because this is what generally. This is how generally in science we go about inquiring, about things. So, to reiterate, if physicalism is true, there must be an objective physical description of subjectivity. However, the more objective a point of view one takes towards consciousness, the further away one moves from subjectivity that defines consciousness. So there is this, some kind of an inherent contradiction. The moment we try to have a scientific approach, objective approach towards the study of consciousness, our study becomes flawed in that very act. Our study becomes flawed right in the beginning, because we are taking a wrong perspective to the problem. So Nagel confesses that as yet he sees no way out of this dilemma. So, the broader question is, does it mean an end to physicalism? Should we, in that case, say that physicalism, is flawed with some kind of contradiction right from the beginning, and therefore physicalism is not a viable solution to the problem of consciousness? So, should we then conclude from what Nagel sort of points out from this? Should we say that physicalism should admit some kind of defeat altogether? So, on the one hand, Nagel is very sympathetic with physicalism, in which case he thinks there must be an objective physical description of consciousness. So Nagel particularly is not in favor, he is not sort of ruthless, so to speak, about the possibility of physicalism. He doesn't want to throw the very possibility of physicalism out of the window. On the other hand, he doesn't see how one could understand consciousness in physical terms without abandoning the subjectivity that makes consciousness what it is. To say that there is currently no way to resolve this dilemma, though, is not to say that it can never be resolved. So all Nagel points out is that currently, from the point of view of physicalism, there seems to be no way to resolve this dilemma. The dilemma, that's pointed out, by him, that study of consciousness, physicalist explanation would require a no-point view of consciousness, whereas consciousness arises only when sort of makes sense only when we sort of talk about the person who is conscious. Otherwise, in sort of apart from that thing which is conscious, it wouldn't make sense at all. So, Nagel, proposes that there might be a time. So, to come out of this impasse, as it seems, Nagel proposes that there might come a time when we will develop concepts that will enable us to understand how consciousness could be a physical phenomena. So, as stated earlier, right in the beginning, what Nagel seems to be suggesting to us is that at the moment we don't have the kind of conceptual framework, the kind of kind of theoretical framework which would sort of give us some kind of clue into how to resolve this resolve this problem. So, but later on it may be possible that there may be some kind of paradigm shift in our conceptual framework. There could be some paradigm shift in the way sort of we have been examining things in sciences, in physical sciences and biological sciences and in life sciences and so on. So until that paradigm shift happens, at the moment this question looks like sort of irresolvable to us. So to sort of illustrate, now again to read a passage from Neil Campbell, to illustrate why there might be a reason for optimism about this issue, let's consider another analogy. Most of us have heard the expression matter is energy. However, there are people alive today. So at some point of time, the expression matter is energy didn't make sense. Say, for example, in the 20th century, sort of when Einstein was not there, when some kind of other theoretical framework, namely quantum physics, was available. So that time, if somebody had said matter is energy, it wouldn't have made sense to anybody, because no theoretical framework is available to understand what is being said, what are we being asked to imagine when somebody says matter is energy, because we have no clue to understand it. However, today there are people alive who understand this claim perfectly. The reason they understand the claim matter is energy and people in the 12th century did not is because it is only in the light of a certain kind of background knowledge that the claim matter is energy can make any sense. Only in the background of a certain theoretical framework would this phrase make some sense. Knowing that this claim requires knowledge of a branch of theoretical physics that didn't exist in the 12th century and with which very few of us are acquainted today, Nagel speculates that one day we might possess a new theoretical background that will enable us to understand the claim consciousness is a physical phenomena. So Nagel says maybe, if in future, sometime in future, that kind of theoretical framework would become available to us, and we would understand, we would sort of be able to meaningfully say then that consciousness is a physical phenomenon. In the way a background in modern physics enables people to understand the claim matter is energy. But for the time being, the claim about consciousness is to us as the claim about matter and energy was to the people in the 12th century. So this is how Nagel, does not end his essay on a pessimistic note. To the contrary, Thomas Nagel ends his paper on an optimistic note, saying that maybe in future, if such kind of theoretical background becomes available to us, then probably the question would start making sense to us in a whole new light. But until then, we'll have to live with this problem. So viewers, we'll end our discussion here. We'll talk about Frank Jackson's argument on the same issue, and we'll we'll talk about Thomas Nagel in more detail in our next lecture. Thank you.
Dear friends, due to paucity of time, we have to stop our lecture here. On that note, we would like to thank Dr. Verma for coming here and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.